to cloud. Okay, so it says recording is in progress.
Wonderful.
Thanks so much, Kieran.
Yes, indeed. You can call me English Upstart if you'd rather, or Upstart or English or anything. I don't really mind, honestly. Or just Lovejoy. A lot of people just call me Lovejoy.
Let me try and say Kieran. I don't know how many times I'll say your name, but let's go with Kieran. And so hey, I really appreciate doing this with me. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's too far out of your comfort zone from what you were telling me about your experience, but you don't know me, and I mean, it's nice of you to to put yourself out there. Let's see. So we have this Facebook group, and to me, the level of discussion and discourse is really, really pathetic on that group. And so I was hoping that we could do some video debates and kind of demonstrate how adults can have a conversation where we're sharing what we believe and why, and we're not trying to make other people look stupid. We're not trying to demean others or say, oh, you think that, well, that it's an exchange of ideas, because
yes.
It's hard enough to articulate what you think, much less do it in a way that the other person understands. So it's hard enough to do that. So we don't need this antagonistic I want to make you look dumb, etc., etc.
No, I quite agree. The problem with communication is that because it's a two-way street, you have to know what you're trying to say, and also the other person has to understand it. A lot of people get confused over terminology. We define things differently, and we end up talking over one another, and people end up having different perspectives on what individual things mean. And as a result, we end up arguing about two completely different things, and it's not very productive. It's actually been my main gripe with other debates I've done, where we start with one person saying one thing. They'll say capitalism is X, and then the other person will treat capitalism as having a completely different definition for the entirety of the debate. So really, they're just talking past one another, and that's, I think, a major issue for this kind of thing. So it would be nice to have some civilized discussion.
That is a huge issue, and I've seen it a lot, in the discussion in the group, and I've written about it too. I've written article or essays, posts. I've posted about that same issue. People are just talking past each other because there's two different definitions in people's minds. And so you're not going to have any kind of effective communication that way. But, okay, so I told everybody about an hour and a half ago, I posted and I said, hey, here's Kieran's kind of his perspective. And it was like an 8-minute, video that you uploaded to YouTube about 3 months ago. And it was pretty good. You discussed anarcho-capitalism and so I think, I mean, do you self-identify? I mean, do you accept the anarcho-capitalist label, or do you want to hedge that somewhat?
No, I'm more than happy to take that label. I think anarcho-capitalism is how I would describe my own perspective. However, I am also a realist, so I think that while anarcho-capitalism is the ideal I wish to strive for, I'm more than happy to accept anything that gets us closer to that, or anything that I think will just improve life in general. For example, if I'm not in favor of, say, how Disney recently had it's having its rights stripped, where it was operating as a sort of self-governing state, Disneyland in Florida, and that was, if that were the case for everything, where they could operate independently and they were free from government interference, then I think that would be a positive thing. However, because it was specifically just for Disney, and therefore they were getting preferential treatment in the market, and it was therefore unfair to its competitors, I think that stripping it of those rights, while technically a bad thing because it means that we're getting more government control and less market control, because it's now a freer market, because the same restrictions are applying to everyone equally and not just one party getting preferential treatment, I think that's actually a positive thing. And so there's a lot of variance in that, where you can see things as positive or negative in one way, or for finding that balance, I think, is important.
Yes. So so you embrace the what is it, the identity kind of,
yes.
I mean, to an extent. So
yes.
So for myself, I think when we talk about political identities, I mean, I think I would be considered a Marxist-Leninist, basically Marxist-Leninist,
Okay.
but I've met Marxist-Leninists that I disagree with on fundamental things. But for the most part, if somebody says they're a Marxist-Leninist, that we pretty much have like-minded perspectives. So to on the surface, it seems like we're universes apart, right? Right?
There will be certain areas where we will fundamentally disagree, and it's likely that we won't be able to shift one another. But I think that there'll be a lot more common ground than we anticipate. I think a lot of the time people are mostly in favor of whatever they perceive as freedom, whatever their definition of freedom is. And sometimes it's freedom from things, sometimes it's freedom for things, and sometimes it's the ability to operate just how they see fit. And ultimately, a lot of people on our side of the spectrum, whatever stripe we happen to take, do kind of just, we appreciate specific things that are found in all circles. We just have different ways of going about it. However, if you're a Marxist-Leninist specifically, I think there will be certain areas we will definitely disagree on. So is there anything in particular that is fundamentally important to your political identity?
So let me try and do my best. I'll take like a couple minutes and I'll just try and formulate my basic worldview and what I think a Marxist-Leninist believes and stuff. I mean, essentially, Marx, is the first person in the Marxist-Leninist identity. So I think he made a bunch of very keen observations. I think his observations regarding, reality were very accurate and very insightful, and they go a long way in showing what the problems are and how we can, fix them and develop a better society. So, the fundamental thing that he pointed out was that there's a such thing as class, and then there's a such thing as, oppositional class interests. So class, basically one's class is determined by their relationship to the means of production. So the means of production are those things that society needs to exist. It's, factories and, communication networks. I mean, basically everything, all the institutions can be considered means of production. And individuals relate to those in different ways. So most people are, workers. And so we have a relationship to the means of production in that we sell our labor. So we sell our labor, and then we earn money by selling our labor. And then that's how we survive. That's our means of survival. There's other folks who have different relationships to the means of production. So they're the owners. So the owners of the means of production, they get profit from the labors of others. So they themselves don't have to, rent their labor time. They own the means of production, and they get profit from other people, selling their labor to the means of production, which means that, there's interests, there's economic interests, there's political interests that are in opposition often. They're not always in opposition. I know a lot of people jump on, it's just coming to my mind. So I was just saying, there's a lot of people that jump on the small business owner and they want to equivocate. Well, not everybody's, an owner, not everybody's a worker. And I think generally speaking, small, when we talk about the capitalists and the capitalist class and those that own the means of production, we're not talking about the small business owners. I would classify the small business owners, as part of the working class. They're forced to, even though they do have employees themselves that they profit from, they're not part of the ruling class that determines, policies and things like that. But so I'm digressing, and
that's an interesting point. I must admit, I don't have a particular issue with that framing. I think that there is you can say there's a distinction between the working class, as in people who work for the means of production, and capitalists who own the means of production. But I think traditionally Marxist-Leninists, would they not classify small business owners as petty bourgeoisie or sort of kulaks, people who are not quite capitalists, but are also not part of the working class. If you're happy to lump them in with the working class, it's not a problem. I'm okay with that. But
Oh, yeah,
what's your perspective on that?
no, that's true. And I mean, even Mao, like he delineated 6 different classes. So
Yes.
I mean, you can make things more complex. I'm trying to
Simplify,
and make it accessible to anybody that's listening. It's just real basic, and that's kind of what I think is necessary now, to help people understand in a simple way, and not an incorrect way. Simple doesn't mean incorrect.
No.
But so we have these 2 classes. We have the capitalist class and we have the working class, and their interests are different. And so Marx, suggested that over time it was inevitable that the working class was going to take political power, that the working class was going to overthrow the capitalist class, and that they were going to implement policies not based on the interests of the capitalist class, but based on interests of the working class. So so before Marx, there was feudalism, and there was a capitalist revolution. Capitalist revolution succeeded feudalism, and it was a vast improvement. So capitalism is a tremendous improvement for people's lives. We can look around and see that longevity is doubled or at least tripled. The quality of life is better in most areas of the world. So capitalism was a tremendous improvement, but we haven't reached utopia. We're not in, we haven't gotten so good that improvement is no longer possible. So there's still room. There's still room for improvement. And so Marx saw the natural progression to be from capitalist society to socialist society. And basically that meant that, capitalist rule was going to be succeeded by proletarian rule. And so that's the Marxist part of Marxist-Leninism.
Yes, I would fundamentally disagree with that, but I understand why he thought it, but I just think it's wrong, but also I don't necessarily think that it would be an improvement. There are issues with this current quote-unquote capitalism, which I think predominantly the issues with them come down to anything the government does. But if the issue is with those people in power, that's not necessarily capitalists, although you could classify them as such. If you're talking about people who own the means of production, and as you mentioned earlier, there are sometimes members of the working class that can own means of production. The good thing about capitalism in this regard, the good thing about markets in general, is that developments allow greater access to the means of production by working class people. For example, nowadays, you can, if you're a working class person, you can access the stock market. You can own parts of the means of production by purchasing parts of companies that exist. I own shares in, Apple and Google and things like that. And I'm working class. We now have access to things like computers and so on and so forth that allow us to start our own businesses and to operate things that would never have been dreamt of in Marx's day. And people's unparalleled present access to the market and to the marketplaces means that we're now closer than ever to just combining working class and capitalists into one homogenous unit, which I think means that this whole idea of, eventually this will all be supplanted by socialism and communism, I think is just unlikely at best, but in particular, I don't think it's even preferable. But if you have anything to respond to that with that, go on.
No. First of all, please interject. Like if I get long-winded and you feel like you want to say something, just stop me. I will listen to what you have to say. So that's interesting. Let me think about that for a little while. We certainly haven't reached the stage where we don't have a distinction between workers and capitalists. So suggesting that eventually we might get there, that's an interesting thought, but I can't agree that right now, especially the way wealth inequality is worse than ever in the history of the known universe, perhaps. I mean, what is it, like 8 people own more than half the rest of the people in the planet. So to suggest that those 8 capitalists don't have a vastly disproportionate amount of political power and every other kind of power, to me doesn't ring true. And that might have not even been what you were saying. So
it was to a certain extent. I must admit when people point out statistics like certain percentage of people, certain type of person, certain individuals have X amount of wealth and therefore have access to the ability to manipulate and control markets and governments and things like that. I understand their concern. The problem with that line of thinking is a lot of it isn't quite as people perceive it. People think, oh, you've got lots of money, therefore you can do X, Y, Z thing, and that will ripple effect and cause this, that, or the other terrible thing to occur. But the biggest influences in global markets, the biggest influences in people's lives and in their rights and all the responsibilities and all the rest of it are governments. And governments have significantly more power than these capitalists that people talk about. You say something like Elon Musk is buying Twitter for $45 billion. Oh my God, it's terrible. He's going to allow people to speak on the internet. How awful. And at the same time, the US government is, stealing trillions of dollars from the working class and spending it on bombs to go and murder people in another country. And I think people are too busy focusing on hating this capitalist who has provided you something that you like for a reasonable price, instead of focusing on the actual issue, which is the government that is trampling on your rights and murdering people. I think it's, that's a bigger problem.
Okay, and that's a good point. Let me get back to the Leninist side of Marxist-Leninism, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem.
So, and then, but there's definitely a lot of discussion that we can have about what you just said as well. But before we get too far afield, I'm just trying to put a basic understanding of my approach to things. So the Leninist part is that, well, we know Lenin successfully put Marx into practice and led a revolution that did, in fact, overthrow the bourgeois government and installed a working class government. This in my opinion, that's exactly what happened. And his government, became the Soviet Union. It was a tremendous success, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So obviously, so these are things. So let me quickly run through it and do your best to just
no,
roll your eyes
I won't interrupt.
So yeah, no, I get it. It's very, that goes against conventional wisdom saying that Soviet Union was a success. But and I understand that that's not going to be a point of agreement. So
it was certainly successful in some areas, definitely.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So the quality of life, access to education, healthcare, electricity, housing, jobs, everything just skyrocketed for the Soviet people. And they industrialized very quickly. But more importantly than the success that they had was what the revolution did to the West. Like the effect the revolution had on the West was to terrify them and to cause them to really, really worry about the same thing happening in Germany or in Britain or in the US. And so they perceived this achievement to be an existential threat to their existence. And so in Marx, going back to what Marx thought, the progress to socialism is going to be at the expense of the capitalist class, because it's the capitalist class that has all the wealth, power, and privilege. And if we progress, they're going to lose that. So they're going to fight against any kind of progress that disenfranchises them from their current obscene disproportion of wealth, power, and privilege that they enjoy. So what did they do? So they had a plan. We are gonna deal with the Soviet Union. We are gonna destroy that worker state. So there's a man named Adolf Hitler. He came out with a book in 1925 called Mein Kampf, and he talked about how he feels it's his what's that word? It's his
duty,
job.
Yeah.
For lack of a better word, but there's much better words. So it's his his calling, kind of, to
his manifest destiny.
Yeah, manifest to defeat the Jewish the Judeo-Bolsheviks. Communism was just a Jewish plot for world domination, etc., etc.
It's funny because I've also heard from the left that capitalism is just a Jewish plot for world domination. It's it seems that on both sides, everyone seems to blame the Jews for everything, which is
No.
kind of
So
ridiculous.
anti-Semitism, of course, is a real thing.
Oh, yes.
You know, I wouldn't characterize, I'm pretty picky about who I call the left. I wouldn't characterize anybody that says that to be on the left. I think they've totally missed the boat. They're not on the left. But I know self-identified leftists say a bunch of things. There's self-identified communists that say a bunch of things that I disagree with.
Oh, yes.
So we're so to me, yeah, World War II can best, well, we didn't talk about World War I. We didn't talk about how World War I enabled the revolution in Russia to be successful. But it did, and because
Oh, yes.
we see World War I as a battle between various empires, for access to markets and colonies. And they were fighting amongst themselves, but they were having the working class do all the dying. And
Yes.
so Marx, or not Marx, but Lenin, utilized that, and he wanted Russia out of the war. He's like, this isn't helping Russians. And it's very popular, and it helped the revolution to succeed. But World War II can best be seen as the capitalist West's attempt to destroy the worker state. So this is, again, my opinion. And I'll wrap it up very quickly. So I'm going to go to the Cold War, and I might even connect to the current events, and then I'll be done with my basic premise. So yeah, to me, Hitler was definitely seen as someone who they could empower and unleash against the worker state and destroy it. So there's no doubt that the Western industrialists in the U.S. and Western Europe helped him, and against the Treaty of Versailles allowed him to rearm. And then the Western powers, Britain and France, did everything they could to push him into the Soviet Union. They gave him the Czechoslovakian springboard. And now Hitler, of course, he had other plans. Like, he understood what was going on, just like Stalin understood very well what was going on with what I'm saying. So Hitler knew what his job was, but he also knew that once he went into the Soviet Union, the West didn't want to have Hitler in power. They weren't going to let Germany be a global power. So they were going to double cross him, and he knew that. So instead of just going into, sorry if you haven't heard this before, I don't.
No, this is a very interesting framing of World War II.
Okay. Carry
on.
I apologize for blindsiding you. I know I've written a bunch about it on the thing. So, but yes, I mean, it's my understanding. So, before going into the Soviet Union, like he was being begged to do by the West, he decided to secure his Western flank, right? So he started fighting. He took over France. He was in a battle with Britain, and then once he had pretty much secured that, then he decided to launch Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in the history of the known world. 3 million people, invaded the Soviet Union, and the West was going to be happy to see the Soviet Union fall, and they expected Germany to rout them very quickly, and of course it didn't happen. Okay, sorry. I mean, let me wrap it up. So what happened was, before the war was even over, the Allies switched sides. They turned their mask came off. They turned against the Soviet Union. They started supporting Nazis in Greece. They supported Imperial Japan in China. And once the Nazis were not going to be a threat, they really switched sides very quickly, embraced the Nazis, embraced the Imperial Japanese, and the new enemy was communism. And that gets us into the Cold War, which is basically 70 years of Western attempt to dominate the globe and create a unilateral, a unipolar world where they have full spectrum dominance. So total military control, total informational control, total economic control. And that's the world that they were seeking to create. And the Soviet Union, when it got dismantled in 1989, that opened the way for this reality to be realized. And so I could go on, or I could let you. I don't know. What do you want to do? I mean, because we're almost to modern times. But if you wanna jump in, we can even skip.
I got to say, that's not the version of World War II I remember happening, but admittedly, I wasn't there. So it's that's a very, very weird framing of it. But I will just grant that, and I'll just say I will assume that things I've been told about World War II are incorrect, and that your framing of it is entirely accurate. I'd like to know where that leaves us now, because let's assume that everything you just said is true. The issue I have is that I don't support current Western governments. I'm an anarchist. I do not support the West, as a homogenous idea. But I also don't support the communist and socialist and fascio-communist governments of things like China and whatnot. So what is the issue with this kind of? What is your issue with this homogenization of the West and how they're operating?
Thank you for that comment, because it gave me time to think and gather my thoughts. So yeah, how does that influence my perspective on things?
Yes.
So I think one of the most important things that needs to be discussed is the successful communist revolution in China that preceded the revolution in Russia and the Soviet Union. So the Chinese revolution in 1949, the Communist Party came to power, and they were, the poorest and most underdeveloped country in the world in 1949. Average lifespan was, 38, 39, maybe 40 years old. And it was just a basket case. And so in that short time, because you had a communist party in power whose existence was defined by benefiting furthering the interests of the working class, as opposed to, in my framework, the Western governments that are they're puppets of a capitalist class. So
right. Okay, I understand. Yes. Okay. In that case, I do have a bit of an issue with that framing. I didn't previously, because I wasn't certain exactly what you were getting at. I don't believe that you can accurately say that the West are puppets of a capitalist class. As far as I can tell, based on my observations of the West, capitalists are often the puppets of the government class. Everything seems to be operated centrally. It's reasonable to say, for example, that large businesses are no longer really independent. They're just wings of the government. If you end up with something sufficiently massive, what you end up doing is getting regulated to the point where the government just control everything you do. So, for example, the largest banks in the US are so heavily regulated by the government that they are basically just government institutions. They're just branches of the Federal Reserve. And this is not an indication that capitalists are in control, but rather that a small centralized group of people who have a monopoly on force are in power. And selector theory implies that essentially, when you have that kind of centralized power structure, what's going to happen is that anything that can be done to assault that by anyone, be it capitalists or the working class or anything like that, will simply just fail, because the people in control are the people in power, and they're going to keep it that way. I think that this framing of the West as being entirely dominated by capitalism is unwise. However, if we are to assume that the West is specifically dominated by capitalists and that capitalists are the ones in control of everything, then, as you pointed out, and as indeed Marx pointed out, capitalism has been massively successful in helping people, and to I would suggest, significantly greater extent than communism was in the East, particularly when it comes to things like the communist revolution in Russia. The result of which was, as you mentioned, quite positive for the people who survived, but for the millions of people who died, it was largely negative. Things like Lysenkoism, resulting in famines and starving that on unprecedented scales throughout human history, are examples specifically of where central planning doesn't work. And indeed, I believe many of the problems in the West are specifically, again, results of central planning, of a large amount of issues being caused by specifically small, powerful groups of people who have monopoly on force, enforcing their will on the people, including the working class. I think where the East succeeded is specifically where things were democratized so that more working class people were involved on the places that were furthest from Soviet control, or rather, sorry, not Soviet control, because Soviets were the small groups, weren't they, that were in charge all around Russia. There was the Soviets technically were the like sort of town council kind of things, weren't they?
Yeah, Soviet councils. That was I mean, an original kind of model that the Soviet Union was maybe going to pursue at one point, but due to so many other factors, it became, it was seen as untenable.
Yes.
And that's definitely understandable how that was maybe something that they thought ideologically would be nice, but realistically was not possible due to a number of factors. But so no, I mean, we could discuss the different things you brought up. I think a lot of the things that is a mainstream conventional wisdom understanding of the Soviet Union and of Lysenkoism and of central planning leading to things like famines. I don't think those are correct perspectives, right? I mean, so for famines, let's talk about famines. So, the area of the Soviet Union that had a famine in 1932, had cyclical famines all the time. And it was the hope that we need to improve and upgrade our agricultural system to end the cyclical famines that forced the Soviet Union to move against the kulaks, because they were prime beneficiaries of a system that was not good for the vast majority and led to famines, but they were getting fat off famine. So that was the accusation against the kulaks, that they would get fat off of famine, and that caused a lot of tension within society. So they modernized and upgraded the agricultural sector, and they forever eradicated famine. China did the same thing. China was known as the land of famine. They had averaged one famine a year for the previous 2,000 years before the CPC came to power, before the Communist Party came to power. Yes. So by the time, within a decade, by 1962, you never saw famine again in China because of the modernizations and development that the Chinese Communist Party implemented. So to me, it's the communists that are eradicating famine. And I just think it's basically, I consider it a capitalist lie, because again, I think the capitalists, they've owned our education system, they've owned our media, and they've indoctrinated us with all these falsehoods. And I mean, that's my perspective. So I see the conventional wisdom that you just shared with me as false, and I think the reality is self-evident. I mean, you can look and see what happened. I mean, they ended the famines. The last famine in Russia was 32. The last famine in China was 62, and that was after decades and decades, centuries, millennia of famine. So it's not fair to say that the communists caused famine, because they actually ended it. But
again, this is a very strange way of framing things. I understand your perspective might be not to trust the West. Totally fine. There's plenty of things about the West I don't trust. Anytime anyone shares any kind of government statistics, my first thought is, okay, and I wonder how wrong they are. It's generally I don't trust anything that comes from the government. The problem again with your framing there is you're saying capitalists control education, capitalists control the media. They don't. Again, my education was funded and produced by the government, and they were the ones who controlled everything. And the media is also controlled by the government, and so on and so forth. Again, it's an issue of who is the actual person in control. Your perspective is it's capitalists. My perspective is it's the government, because they're the ones who actually have the power.
Thank you for clarifying. Thank you for clarifying that. That is very important in any kind of discussion, to isolate the core differences, because that way we don't have to waste time on ancillary things. Because that's another thing I see in our group discussions where there's obvious core differences, and people just want to spend all this time about things that aren't even intrinsic to the actual differences. So that's thank you for highlighting that.
I think if you're going to talk about something like Western propaganda regarding the East, I understand there will be a large amount of it. There will definitely be things I've been told that are not true about Russia, about China, about any kind of socialist or communist society. There will definitely be things I will have been told that are just not true. There are, however, going to be a lot of things that inevitably, if it's part of your perspective, that you are going to disbelieve as a member, as a facet of confirmation bias. It's likely that, for example, if you tell me something about the West that's negative, I'm probably going to go, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, because I actually don't like the West, at least not the Western governments, that is. But I think likewise, if I were to tell you something negative about the East in some regard, if I was to tell you something negative about Russia or the CCP, etc., chances are you're going to automatically disbelieve it just because that's your perspective. And I understand that's it's a human thing to do. The problem is that it will mean that legitimate criticism is likely to be discarded just on a whim. And again, I'm guilty of this as well. We are only human, and we are bound to sort of stick to our ideological corners. But the problem with that then is that if we are to automatically disbelieve anything negative said about our camp, then we're unlikely to ever change our minds about anything. And it means that discussion doesn't really get anywhere. If I were to, for example, point out, when referencing Lysenkoism, that this belief, this quote unquote scientific belief, that plants were naturally communist because nature is communist, and therefore smaller groups of plants placed in tight communities with one another would create a natural yield through sort of comradeship by having a sort of working class consciousness within plants. Didn't work, didn't make any sense, not in any way scientific, but was kind of believed throughout the Soviet Union, not necessarily because of communism. I don't think this is communism's fault at all, but because at the time power was concentrated within Stalin specifically. I believe it was Stalin at this time, and the problem with that wasn't communism. It was the fact that the person in control was someone who was had a monopoly on force, and who controlled great swathes of people and had the ability to modify on a whim X, Y, or Z thing. And because of centralized government planning and the ability to operate on a massive scale, things that had massive negative consequences, the results were devastating. Whereas if people were operating on a smaller scale and they had the ability to, for example, control their own land, and they could therefore create greater yields by doing things that actually made sense, what you end up with is people like the kulaks, who get to use their small amount of land to produce food and therefore sell it and make a profit, and so on and so forth. What you found was the smaller scale capitalists with the ability to control and operate their own means of production thrived, the kulaks, and the centrally planned governments, whenever they made an error, for example, operating Lysenkoism, resulted in massive negative consequences for the populace. It's entirely possible that everything I believe about it is government propaganda that's been forced on my throat by the West. That's possible. But even assuming that it's true, just a little bit, it's an example not necessarily of how communism has failed, but specifically how government control failed. And that, I think, is the issue that typically anarchists have. It's not necessarily with ideas like communism, it's with specifically central planning, government power, and things like that. So if you, as a Marxist-Leninist, believe that control should reside primarily with the people, a sort of a dictatorship of the proletariat, I believe is how Marx framed it, then I wouldn't necessarily have any issue with that, as long as power is decentralized and given to the people. The problem comes then with people saying, okay, and in order to do this, what we need is a massive totalitarian state like the CCP or the CCCP, and that they need to be in control of everything, because that's where you lose me. Do you have a perspective on that?
Thank you for asking. I do. Yeah, a lot of what you said, I really do want to respond to. And I mean, I'm trying to figure out if there's anything that I want to say more than just responding to that, just to make sure we're not not leaving anything on the table that we haven't gone over.
We can always come back to stuff if there's something you remember later on that you think, oh,
yeah.
I need to talk
So
about.
I think the organic course of this discussion is good. I think you bring up interesting points, and I do want to articulate a response. So let me ask you this. So in my mind, it seems obvious that the workers' state that resulted in the Soviet Union and Stalin specifically was interested in upgrading the agricultural system. Do you think he wanted a system that didn't result in cyclical famines? I mean, so for me, I think I want to establish the motives. So Stalin was motivated to improve the agriculture system. Can we agree on that, or is that?
I think that from what I've read of him, Stalin was predominantly motivated by power. But let's assume that it's true that what he wants specifically is the best thing for the Russian populace, and that he wants specifically to end things like famines, and he wants people to no longer be hungry. Let's just grant that, okay?
Yeah, and I think that's the reality. I think the reality was that he had allowed the kulaks to continue their system, but when there was a famine in the late 20s, at that point he said, "Okay, I'm sorry, it's we've got to do something," and so that something was to overthrow their power. So the kulaks had a certain amount of power due to being the food producers, and they weren't willing to compromise that power or to give it away in favor of a better system that's going to be better for the Soviet Union. So Stalin tried to work with them, but when there was another famine in the late 20s, he's like, okay, we can't do that anymore. Sorry.
It's all right, take your time.
So what resulted, was basically a political war between the Soviet state and this sector of society that found themselves at a disagreement, and it became a violent contest, and the Soviet government won. The kulaks lost.
I'm sorry, that's fantastic framing of that. A government rounding up and murdering a bunch of individuals is a war that they lost. Sure. I mean, I admittedly, if I'm guessing that the Nazis were also, that was just a war against the Jews. They were fighting a war with each other, and the Jews lost. That's
So yeah, the Soviet government, to me, would have been irresponsible to allow this small sector of society to keep progress from happening. And so they did what they had to do. It wasn't their first choice, but it was their only choice, and it was their only choice due to the kulaks' intransigence and absolute refusal to compromise and to allow a better system that isn't prone to cyclical famine.
Okay, just assuming that your framing of that is accurate. I must admit, I have a sort of I find it morally repugnant. The idea that anyone in power, any government, any people who claim to be responsible and in charge for people might say, that person over there isn't doing what I want, I'm going to kill them and take their stuff. That seems to me to be fundamentally immoral. The perspective I seem to get from Marxist-Leninists, and even here from yourself, is, but it was okay because the government was doing it and their plan was to help people. Fundamentally, that just seems wrong to me. I don't believe you ought to be able to use force to murder your political opponents and take their stuff because you think you've got a better idea on how the country ought to be run. And if we are going to accept that, then essentially all we're assuming is that might makes right, provided you happen to have popular support, which is certainly a perspective that a lot of people seem to have, but it's not my own. Do you agree with that framing?
Well, so I mean, say there's 1 million people in your society, and 999 of them want to progress, but an individual says, no, we're not going to do that progress. I don't want that progress. So I mean, so to me, this whole anti-authoritarianism as a political approach, as a political perspective, it seems nonsensical to me, because improvement in society and advancement and making people's lives better, you have to utilize there has to be laws, there has to be law enforcement, there has to be you can't have these things, you can't have improvement, you can't have a plan to make things better and enact that plan without utilizing authority against those who oppose it. And if you're saying
that is a perspective I'm okay with,
you won't allow any progress unless it is 100% unanimous that everybody on the planet decides, yes, we're going to do this. To me, it's a direct plane to nowhere. Like it's.
I'm willing to accept that the framing of everyone has to agree or you can't do it is ridiculous. You are quite right. I also don't believe that. It's not something I would have as a perspective. I think that personally, if you wish to opt out of any given government thing, that you ought to be able to do so. I think that if 999,000 people believe one thing and one person believes that the opposite, provided they're not hurting anyone, that's not really an issue. The question then becomes, well, what counts as hurting people? Does preventing progress, as you have put it, count as hurting people? At which point, I guess this government you're referring to would indeed think, well, you're not allowing us to do what we want to do, therefore we ought to be able to, assert our physical authority over you. There is a distinction between having laws, for example, those that protect the rights of life, liberty, and property, which I believe are fundamental to a free and positively progressing society, and the ability to just kill people and take their stuff. That's quite different. If I, for example, recognize that you have a number of organs that are important for functioning life, and that killing you and taking all of those organs and giving them to other people will result in more people surviving than you, technically what I've done there is helped a lot of people, and in exchange all I've done is had to kill one person. This seems to be the argument that's coming from, I hesitate to say the left in this example, but specifically Stalinist-Leninist seems to be, well, there's lots of people we can benefit that can benefit from us doing this one authoritarian thing, therefore we ought to be able to do it because it'll benefit more people than the people who are losing out. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I don't think you should be allowed to murder people for the benefit of others. I don't believe you should be allowed to steal for the benefit of others, particularly when I don't think it works. Sometimes it will work. There's definitely been cases, for example, in the East where you have resulted in people no longer suffering from famines, you have resulted in quality of life improving, etc., etc. However, typically speaking, when you then free the people and allow them to operate in a more free market capacity, the result is a greater lifting. For example, in CCP, the less communist they've become and the more capitalist they've become, the better it has gotten for people. I mean, we've got to the point now where they're basically just a fascist government, and the bad problems in China are caused by the government, and all the free markets are the parts of them that have improved people's lives the most. If we're going to have this kind of ideological opposition where you think that state enforcement of things that you think will benefit people in the long term is a positive, and I believe that any kind of enforced state monopoly is automatically negative, then this is a disagreement that is not going to be solved in this conversation. That's not to say that I don't think this conversation will be fruitful. It's just to say that I think we're at odds in to such a degree that we won't come any closer towards one another. There's not going to be a happy middle ground here. There's going to be my perspective of we have to have no government, and there's going to be your perspective of we have to have government. So that's a fundamental disagreement.
And my hope is that our differing perspectives will lead to some good discussions, in the group chat. Hopefully some more some better quality discussions than the ones I've seen. Maybe and maybe not.
It's interesting to hear you say that you are, because of course the group itself is ANCOMs versus ANCAPs, but your perspective seems to be not anarcho-communism, but specifically Marxist-Leninist communism, and therefore sort of narchy as opposed to anarchy. You are it's with rulers with rules. So
And I thought it was libertarians versus communists.
oh, sorry, my apologies. We're in I'm in multiple groups. I thought this
Me
was
too.
the ANCOMs versus
No, I
ANCAPs
thought you were
ones.
right. I actually thought you were right because I'm also in a lot of groups and I thought I confused groups. But okay, no, I think I'm right. I think it was this is specifically for the communist libertarian groups.
Right, that's fine. That's okay. That's just me not paying attention. Then it's the wrong group. In which case, that's actually interesting because I genuinely thought this was just going to be me saying to an anarcho-communist, "So I'd be totally fine with you existing. Let's do that," and them going, "Cool." Which you know is I'm happy to actually have a proper discussion because again our perspectives are so completely diametrically opposed. The interest. Sorry, go on.
What do you think? Like, what do you think is a fundamental difference that makes that? I mean, can you articulate, you know, from your perspective, what is the core difference in, you know, belief or perception that separates our two views?
I believe that no individual ought to have a monopoly on violence, and that enforcement of the non-aggression principle should be done at an individual level by individuals. That any kind of collective needs to be entirely consensual, and that fundamentally all things come down to does this individual action violate the consent of anyone involved? Does it violate their rights to life, liberty, or property, which I believe are fundamental? And that's basically where my philosophy ends. If anything negatively impacts someone's right to life, liberty, or property, it is wrong. If anything violates someone's consent, that is wrong. And if anyone attempts to deny these rights via a monopoly on force, I believe that they are wrong. Therefore, that all governments are illegitimate, regardless of how popular they are. And indeed, in particular, they usually are not. Whereas your perspective seems to be that provided the goal or the intended outcome of a given collective action is positive for the most part for the majority of people, that therefore an authority and a monopoly on violence is not only justified but preferential, which is a perspective that a lot of people hold. It's just not my own. Do you think that's an accurate framing of your position?
No, I mean, no, it's educational to hear you explain your perspective on our two different positions. You know, what I would highlight about our two differing positions is that nowhere does what I perceive to be the reality of oppositional class interests and an ongoing global class struggle between a capitalist dictatorship in the West that owns the governments and all the institutions lock, stock, and barrel 1,000%, against the successful working class revolutions that have occurred in the late USSR, current modern China, Cuba, Vietnam. So to me, you know, what you're doing is to me it's you're engaging in liberalism, classical liberalism, if you would like, but you are looking at things idealistically in a vacuum and saying, how should things be? And to me, as a materialist, I look at, you know, the reality as it is, the material reality, the fundamental existing way things are, and saying, you know, in this struggle against the you know, the capitalist class dictatorship that has had its way in the West. In the West, it is totally victorious. I mean, it has defeated the working class. The working class is so defeated, they don't even know there's a war going on. That's how defeated they are. And you know, whereas you have, you know, proletarian dictatorships that came to power in China, and Cuba, Vietnam, you know, Venezuela. So you have a block of anti-imperialist countries resisting Western capitalist imperialist domination. And again, and that's what the Cold War was, right? The Cold War was the West's attempt to control the planet and they were being resisted by the Soviet Union. But then you had the Soviet Union and the Sino-Soviet split, and that was great for the West. But now they thought they would incorporate China into their worldview, and the Communist Party of China was very smart to agree. So yeah, I'll play by your guys' rules, but guess what? Because we're a proletarian dictatorship, and we're not constrained by your silly facade of democracy, which is just a transparent disguise of capitalist dictatorship. We're not constrained by that. We're just going to do what's in our people's best interest, and in the best interest of the global working class. So that's what I feel.
Okay, that was a very interesting statement, honestly. By beginning with, I'm a materialist, I like to perceive how things really are, and then talking about the West being a capitalist dictatorship and the East being a proletariat dictatorship, I got to say, it's that's some wacky framing. I fundamentally disagree on a number of issues there, but let's just assume that framing is correct. I'll just grant everything you said there. My issue then would be, I also don't support the West or the East. I think they're both terrible. I think that the fascio-communist dictatorships in China and Russia are awful, and I believe that the quote-unquote capitalist dictatorships in the West, for example, the United States and the government of Great Britain, are also terrible, but for vastly different reasons. But they have the same fundamental issue, which is that the problems that arise from them come specifically from government control of individual parts of the economy. Anywhere where the government is not involved, things are good. Anywhere where the government is more and more involved, things get worse and worse and worse. And this seems to be the case, not just here in the West, but also in the East. Anywhere where there's more government control, you end up with more issues. Anywhere where there's more market control, the result is innovation and things getting cheaper and things becoming more widely available for the working class. The working class has it better now in the West than they ever have throughout all of history. It's our easy access to high-calorie food, to operating our own means of production, access to electronics and technology beyond the wildest dreams of anything previously, is now a direct result of capitalist free markets. And everywhere where there is opposition to this in the form of government control, everything is stagnating, is getting worse. What you mentioned previously, Western education. And yes, Western education is in decline, precisely because it's being controlled by the governments. Everywhere where there is education that is not being controlled by the government, it's improving. And this is the same with pretty much every area of life, as far as I can tell. Everywhere that the government has more and more influence gets worse and worse, and everywhere where the market has more and more influence, capitalists, as you have it, would control it. It gets better and better. This means that typically, if we're going to have this kind of discussion of the West is evil, the East is great, I'm going to have an issue with that. But not because the East isn't necessarily good. It's that the bad parts of it are the parts that I think you would fundamentally think are good. Is that correct? You're in favor of the CCP and the CCCP. These are kind of organizations that you would voluntarily support, that you would think, yes, fantastic, what great ideas?
I mean, again, I believe that the Soviet Union did tremendous things to improve the lives of the vast majority. And they did it despite having, the Western powers doing their utmost to destroy them as a government and as a society, with the invasion of Hitler and then the subsequent Cold War. So I think they did tremendous things. They did far more with far less than the West did. But China is my gold standard, right? Like China is proof. Thank God for China, because they're proof that they're proof. They are the living proof, the embodiment of the superiority of working class dictatorship over capitalist class dictatorship. And how could they not be? Because how can a government predicated on benefiting the interests of a small minority of wealthy elites not do a better job or not do a worse job than a government predicated on doing benefiting the vast majority?
I'll tell you
So,
how. I can give it a specific example of how that could be the case by them being wrong. If,
okay.
for example, you say, I wish to benefit the vast majority of people, and I'm going to do so by factor X. I'm going to do this one thing, and that's going to benefit everyone. And it doesn't work,
Yeah.
or it has the opposite effect, then that's how you end up doing
But
worse.
think
For
of it.
example,
Okay.
if you are someone who believes that, oh, there's a bunch of poor people, and what we need to do is print $1 million and give everyone $1 million, and that will solve poverty. The reason that it won't work is obviously because that will just devalue the currency, and it will mean that suddenly there's the price floor raises for everything, and you end up with massive inflation, and it doesn't work. People's intentions don't matter. Their outcomes matter. And while it is true that for a specific amount of people, China's policies have improved their lives, there are also a great number of people that it has made worse, or the people that it specifically killed. And that is not to say that the West hasn't done this as well. The West has killed a bunch of people, and I'm also against that. But just saying, well, look, it's for the people, therefore it is good, and therefore it will automatically be good, isn't accurate. That's just inaccurate. In particular, when you're confusing something's stated aims with its actual aims. The Chinese Communist Party being in control is not necessarily specifically to the benefit of the people. It's to the benefit, as with all things in selector theory, to the people in power. That's why there's always consolidation of power within the centralist party members. That's why there's always specific oligarchs that are controlled by the government. That's why there are always industries that are controlled by them. And that's also why there are a number of issues with people's freedoms. You can, for example, say, yes, China has improved people's lives in X, Y, or Z way, but they've also restricted freedoms in Z, Y, and B way. And as a result, people have it better in one way, but worse in another. And again, it comes down to government control. What do the government have control over? Some things they have less control over, they end up improving. Some things they have more control over, they end up getting worse. For example, the internet in China being so heavily censored. I would not want Chinese censorship over the internet in the West, and I'm sure you wouldn't either. And yet, you're still going to support the Chinese government, despite this problem, because you think, well, the material possessions of the members of the Chinese Communist Party and their proletariat have improved dramatically. So by lumping in all the positives and ignoring the negatives, yes, I can see the Chinese Communist Party as being a positive thing, but I think you have to accept that there are negatives and there are problems with it, and that they are caused inherently not by them being communists, but by them being a government. Is that something you're happy to accept?
Well, I mean, let me address that. I don't think I've directly responded to that assertion. I mean, and I've heard it before. I mean, and it's kind of an orthodoxy. It's a mantra, right? And I've heard. Well, no, I mean, hold on. So I mean, I let me try and say it how I heard you say it. I mean, it's basically society. It does well where government doesn't, get their hands in, and then where government does get their hands in, it does bad. I mean, that's basically what you said. So to me, to objectively analyze that statement, I would say that it's false. But I mean, I understand that it's a common perspective, and I hear it, and it's liberty far, it's definitely it's an anarcho-capitalist orthodoxy. Like it's something that they uphold, and they are certain it's true. I don't believe that's true. And I mean, we can discuss different, cases where it's not true, where government intervention has tremendously been beneficial. I mean,
I've not yet heard a single example of this being the case. I've heard a lot of people say, well, what about this? What about that? What about the other thing? And every time when I look into it further, because a lot of the times they seem like the case on the surface. For example, when people point out, what's the thing in the US, the New Deal. People point to the New Deal and say, see, that got them out of the Great Depression, and it was massively beneficial. No, World War II got them out of the Great Depression by destroying all of their competitors, and then basically creating a market where they were the only people who were free. The New Deal, if anything, prolonged the Great Depression, and was basically terrible for everyone involved. There were, however, benefits to it in forms of increased infrastructure and whatnot, but the issues with people's examples whenever they come up with things are that a lot of the times on the surface they look like, yes, maybe that did help, until you dig a little deeper and you
Yeah.
say, okay, but it created X problem and Y problem and Z
No,
problem.
and I've seen those, and to the credit of anarcho-capitalists, I've seen where they make definitely plausible and persuasive arguments, contradicting somebody that says, oh, well, what about this? So to your credit, I mean, I will say that I've seen that happen before. But I think more importantly, to this general discussion, instead of me trying to identify areas and having you knock it down, what's more important to point out is the class nature of the government. And so I think in the West, you have a capitalist class that really isn't interested in doing things to benefit the vast majority, other than to placate them and keep them from becoming revolutionary and angry. So they're gonna give them just enough to keep them, placated, and as long as they're disenfranchised and have no political power whatsoever, can't threaten any of the system dominated by the capitalist class and their political accomplices, that they're happy to do that. And so they provide a much better quality of life to imperial citizens than, say, they offer to the countries that are deemed for exploitation and extraction of wealth. So people in the West are treated much better than the people in Nigeria. The literacy rate in Nigeria is like 60%. Nigeria is a very, very wealthy country, but they are not, they have been designated by the empire to be a producer nation that is going to produce things for the West. So we profit from them and we exploit them. But I'm going
to have to. Can I interject there?
Sure.
I agreed with your framing to begin with. It's something I would happily accept with alongside selector theory. The idea that whoever is currently in control, they want disenfranchisement from the working class. They want people to have no political capital and have no ability to affect change. This is something I'm 100% on board with. I think, yes, that is definitely the case in the West. In fact, my channel name used to be Bread and Circuses, the Roman concept, the panem et circens, and as long as people are sufficiently entertained and fed, they will not rebel, and therefore whoever has a monopoly on violence can maintain their stranglehold. That's something I'm willing to accept. That is the case. That's definitely true. The problem then comes with when you're saying that Nigeria, for example, has been designated by the West as some sort of something not worthy of the implementation of Western principles that positively affect its citizens. We don't control Nigeria. If I were to turn up in Nigeria and declare that I controlled it and it was now under the jurisdiction of the West, that would be considered imperialism and would be wrong, and people would oppose it. We don't get to just turn up places and take over and say, you're a Western liberal democracy now, because people have complained about that and said we can't do it anymore. I don't know what perspective you have here that says that we ought to do so. It's not up to us what happens in Nigeria. It's not up to me. It's not up to people who are actually in power. It's up to the Nigerians, and unfortunately for them, they haven't decided on anything relating to Western liberal democracy, which has, as far as I'm concerned, produced the best outcomes thus far. It's not that I'm necessarily in favor of our governments. It's just that they seem to have, for the most part, done a relatively okay job, apart from where they've gone horribly wrong. So
that's going to turn our conversation a little bit, which is fine.
No. Please continue. Go back to whatever it was you were saying.
I don't remember.
It's just that I don't think that Nigeria is really our responsibility, and
no. So let me address that, because it's good. It's good. We're moving on. I don't even remember what we were talking about before. After 1945. The West has engaged in an average of one regime change a year. So the West has attempted to violently overthrow a foreign government on the average of once a year since 1945.
And I would happily oppose that.
So, but that's called neocolonialism. We are not trying to overthrow Nigeria, because we have in place a puppet government that does exactly what we want. And what we want is they can say, they don't care about the people of Nigeria. What's important to them is the kickbacks from all the Western profits that are coming from the exploitation of Nigerian oil. So that's called neocolonialism. I mean, it's a real thing, and that's why we
no, I agree.
That's why the US has military installations in over 75% of the world's governments. It's why we've been in perpetual war for over 100 years.
Yes.
I mean, this is what, so again, from my perspective, this is the capitalist class. And it's not every capitalist has a say, but I'm telling you, they see things through a class perspective. They're very class oriented, and they understand that their interests are not going to be furthered by allowing socialism just to develop organically. So they actively go out and try and oppose it, not just socialism, but any kind of nation state that tries to, be an impediment to whatever their interests are. And it's imperialism, but it's guided by, a capitalist class perspective and approach to things. And so for me, I do get the argument a lot, and I reject it that the government is somehow an entity that is separable from the capitalist class.
Okay.
It's not the working class that controls the government. It's the
it's also not the capitalist class that control the government. This is, I think, going to be our fundamental disagreement. Okay. And unfortunately, I think that we actually technically agree. Your position is that the capitalist class is controlling the government and the government is doing terrible things. My perspective is the government is doing terrible things. I'm just one step removed from what you're saying. The problem is you're saying that they view things through a lens of class. In my personal experience, the only people who view things in a lens of class are Marxists. Specifically, whenever I have a discussion with anyone relating to this, they'll talk about let's again go back to selector theory. Everything comes down to individual choices. So while you may belong to a specific group, a specific class, a specific race, a specific sex, a specific orientation of one thing or the other, you still act as an individual. And while some things may appear as though a specific class or a specific group or are acting in a specific way, individuals from within that group can always act differently. As you stated, not all capitalists are involved in this what did you call it, capitalist dictatorship. So if not all capitalists are involved in the capitalist dictatorship, then presumably it's not the entire class that are involved in it. And that's where I would have the distinction. That's why I'm an individualist and not a collectivist, because ultimately, because people are individuals and can act rationally and independently of other members of their group, the result is that it's not necessarily a class issue. In the UK, where I am from, class is is fundamental to the way we operate. There's a lot of working class solidarity. People feel very strongly that they are working class. I'm from the north, which is a working class haven. Everyone here is working class. There's a lot of kind of political beliefs that come with it. People hating Margaret Thatcher, people being in favor of mines, people hating the government in particular, but in particular hating the Tories specifically, so on and so forth. There's a lot of baggage that comes with it. But at the end of the day, we're all individuals. And in the last elections, a lot of the working class in the north voted for the Tories, which are people who we've historically despised. And this is because people's individual tastes were different. While we don't operate as a class, we see ourselves as one themselves. And I think this is the kind of the problem that we have here when we're not quite talking past one another, but this is the one area of disagreement where we're gonna there's going to be just a stop because specifically you're seeing it as government bad because capitalism bad because they're the same thing, whereas I'm just saying government bad, full stop. And that's the it's as long as you're concerned with capitalism as a class because they control the government, and I'm concerned with the government being the problem, I think we can agree that the Western governments are bad. We can accept that. We can both say Western government's bad. Here's a list of bad things that Western governments have done, including, for example, imperialism, neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism, etc. And we can accept that and agree with that. But I'm also going to have an issue with the governments in China and Russia because they're governments, whereas you're going to say, but they're governments of the people and are therefore okay. And I think that Is that the distinction that we're going to have here? Is it you happy to accept that framing?
Well, they're a government for the people, right? So I believe the governments in the West are of by and for the capitalist class, and the government in China is of by and for the working class.
Okay.
And I mean, we can say maybe not of, because granted, party members are billionaires, many of them, and that is definitely true. But that has been one of those, it's one of those contradictions. It's been a necessity of engaging in the world system and having incredibly, fast growth, etc. You're going to, you can't not engage with the capitalist world and not be capitalist, right? So for instance, if Mao would have said, hey, we are not going to allow private property. So China's not going to allow private property. So they're going to keep class abolished, no business owners. What would have happened? Well, they would have never been allowed to be part of the global market. They would have been sanctioned. They would have been a lot less wealthy. And, they would have, the trillions and trillions of dollars in direct foreign capital investment would not have been there for them to benefit from. So yes. what the government has done, because they're not a capitalist dictatorship, because they care about the people, they have used those investments and made sure that capitalism works for China and the Chinese working class. So wages have tripled every 10 years for 40 years straight. Life expectancy, quality of life, access to education, healthcare, that's all skyrocketed tremendously because you have a government that cares about the people and that genuinely not pretends to, like in the West, genuinely cares about furthering the interests of the people and making sure the people understand that they are a communist government, on the side of the working class. And what has resulted, this is very interesting, what has resulted is unprecedented appreciation of the Chinese people for the Chinese Communist Party. So Harvard, for instance, recently did a poll, and I think in 2016 was the most recent poll, and they're like, how satisfied are you? And they did this in a lot of countries. They did the exact same polling in a lot of countries. China was 96% satisfied, whereas the West, in the United States, 38%. Exact same poll conducted by Harvard, 96% satisfaction in China for obvious reasons, whereas for other obvious reasons, about 38% in the US. So this is.
Can I just interject? I would say that it is likely that the 96% does come, in fact, from obvious reasons. However, I think you and I might differ on what those obvious reasons are. I'm assuming you've heard the old joke, how's life under China? I can't complain. It seems to be the case that when you quash freedom of expression and are more than happy to disappear people who oppose the government and have, for example, social credit scores, which, ensure that people have to stay in line and track with what the party is saying, or they end up dead, then yes, of course, people are going to say, yes, I love China. Please don't kill me or take my children away from me. I'm more than happy to accept that people will indeed say they're happy in China. I don't necessarily believe them. As I've known people from China who have come to the West and they describe it as escaping from China, basically. Every single one of them is very much so of the opinion that they're very glad that they're no longer in China because it's terrible. However, they may just be a small isolated portion of people. They may just be individuals who happen to oppose the Chinese government for whatever reason, and perhaps they're even just lying to me outright about what they're saying. I'm more than happy to accept that. It's possible that everyone who's spoken to me about it, who's from China, has just been wrong on all accounts. I'm happy to accept that. However, we know for a fact that the Chinese government does quash people's ability to respond negatively about the Chinese government. And when you have that kind of incentive, where if you speak out against the Chinese government, negative things happen, people are bound to not oppose it as a result. Any kind of mind virus, which has a kind of an ability to protect itself through force, will inevitably yield a greater proportion of people with it. For example, take Islam as a standard thing. Islam has with it if you become an apostate if you leave Islam, they kill you. So there's going to be a lot of people who are members of the Muslim community who do not want to be Muslim, and can't leave, because if they leave, they get killed. So they just continue to be members of the Muslim population. And that, I think, is something that you're likely to see in any kind of dictatorship where people can be killed for disagreeing.
I mean, so look, I haven't been to China. I know a lot of people in China. A lot of people. There's some people in this group that live in China in our Facebook group, and they just, they depict a totally different picture of the one that you just described. So in 2013, they made a point of cracking down on corruption. Corruption was a huge problem. It really stunted the growth and development. And it also was in response to incredible growth and development, was incredible corruption. And ever since then, they've really solicited. They have solicited the citizens to turn in crooked politicians. If you have a government official that's not doing something, hey, let us know, and because we want to take care of it. So we're talking about Harvard, and they were working with what was the main polling organization? Edelman's. I think it was Harvard and Edelman, and they were conducting anonymous polling in China. And to me, it seems like an irrational analysis to assume that everybody's lying, especially considering the tripling of wages every 10 years for 40 years, the huge skyrocketing of quality of life and access to education, healthcare, transportation. Like they have every reason to be overwhelmingly thankful for their government. And I think they are. I think they are. And I don't think they're scared to be disappeared. I think that's a certain Western kind of framework and understanding that is totally divorced from actual reality that exists in China.
Well, we've seen example after example of people specifically speaking out against the government and then losing the ability to, for example, own property, have money in bank accounts, use public transport, etc. These kind of things that occur repeatedly in China are bound to result in people not being in favor of the Chinese government, but having to say that they support them. That is inevitable. Any kind of selective pressure where that is the selective pressure will inevitably result in people falsely being in favor of it. However, I'm willing to accept that the polling is accurate. Let's just say it is. Let's just say that everyone there is in favor of it. What it sounds like, because you're bringing up things like, for example, wages going up, people making more money, people being allowed to own property, etc. These things seem like capitalist positives. These seem like things that, because China has access to Western markets, and because they're allowing people to own property and own the means of production and produce things and make money and live life like capitalists, it seems like life is improving under China specifically because of them becoming more capitalist. In which case, I got to say, I don't think that's necessarily a win for the CCP. Sorry, CCP? Is it the CCP or the CCCP? Oh, CCCP was Russia. Sorry, my apologies.
Well, so CCP, I used a while and I didn't realize, so that I think it's kind of seen as derogatory. So CCP is what the Western media will call them. I think they prefer CPC. Communist Party of China is what the Communist Party of China prefers. The West tries to denigrate them by calling it the Chinese Communist Party. And I don't know why one is better, but that's what I've learned that recently. So so I mean, again, the working class of China are the working class of China, and their interests are being furthered by the Communist Party of China. And so, the Communist Party of China wins when the working class of China does better, and when the working class of China appreciates and understands the Communist Party of China. So it's like a symbiotic thing. And so you introduce this perspective that, well, it sounds like capitalism, so that means the Communist Party of China is losing. That confuses me, because I mean, the Chinese people, the vast majority are workers. They're not capitalists. Capitalists are people that own the means of production and that have and the problem with the ownership of the means of production is that those people will come together and start to dominate, the political life. And as they dominate the political life, they'll dominate the media life and the nation's, the society's discourse, and then they'll engage in propaganda, which we haven't really talked about propaganda here in the West, but it's really bad.
Propaganda is terrible everywhere. There's nowhere that you're safe from propaganda. It's inevitable and it permeates everything. But I've got to say, I think we've reached that point where I can't remember if it was before we started the video or if it was right at the beginning. I mentioned that we were going to have a point where we disagreed on a particular definition of a word, and as a result, we were talking past one another. I think that's what's happened here. When I say capitalism, I'm referring to the philosophical concept of capitalism. So I, for example, consider myself a capitalist. However, based on what you've stated about the ownership of the means of production, etc., I think that you wouldn't consider me to be a capitalist, quote unquote, would you? Because your definition of capitalism is a class thing, whereas my definition of capitalism is a philosophical thing. As a result, what I was saying there was that it sounds like communism was losing, not the Communist Party necessarily. I was saying that it sounded like communism was losing because capitalism as a philosophy was doing better, was improving the lives of people by giving them access to markets and improving their lives by giving them more wages and access to commodities, etc. Whereas, so that was my perspective, was capitalism was winning, communism was losing because capitalism was what was improving people's lives. Whereas you saying the Communist Party were doing all right, that's fine. I'm more than happy to accept that. I would just consider them to be capitalists. Whereas you wouldn't.
Right. And I mean, another way is, communism is the effort to improve people's the lives of the working class, whereas capitalism is the effort to improve the lives of the capitalist class. But again,
that's a definition that I wouldn't accept. So if generally speaking, when I've heard people define communism or when I've heard them define capitalism, I've never encountered that specific definition of it. However, if you're going to say that capitalism is improving the lives of the capitalist class and communism is improving the lives of the people, then I believe that capitalism is communism, because my perspective would be that capitalism improves the lives of the working class, because it has for me and for every other working class person I know, that our lives have been improved dramatically by our ability to operate within a capitalist economy. Even if our capitalist economies are what's the word, are kind of they're prevented from operating to their fullest potential by government interference. Right now, it's very difficult for me to start a business, not because I don't have the capital to do so, not because I don't have the effort or the mind or the anything else related to it, but because there will be government bureaucracy preventing me from doing so. There will be red tape, there will be regulations, there will be taxes and things like that that will prevent me from doing so. The reason I can't access the means of production is because the government is preventing me from doing so. That doesn't sound like capitalism to me. That sounds like government interference in the market. Whereas if you were to if I were to operate my own means of production, for example, I can utilize a laptop to start an online business. Anything that allows me to benefit myself by operating in a free market, I would consider to be capitalism. However, you would say that's not capitalism. Capitalism is utilizing the government for the benefits of the capitalist class. And that's where the distinction, I think, lies in your framing of capitalism as a class struggle for capitalists against the working class, and my framing of capitalism as a philosophy that benefits the individual. So I think that's really the only thing we actually disagree on, because everything else just comes down to, you want to help people, I want to help people. I think the best way to do it is through personal economic freedom. You believe that it's through the utilization of the government to produce more equitable outcomes for the working class. Is that right?
And I mean, it's not necessarily equitable, because China isn't exactly equitable at this point in time, but you have a skyrocketing of, quality of life and every metric basically that you could possibly, measure quality of life or, so yeah, no, that's a very good, we started doing it. I started sliding into a totally different definition of capitalism. And I'm glad you pointed that out. Because I did. So, but yeah, because, I'm seeing things again through the lens of class struggle, right? Through the lens of oppositional class interests. And I think not to do that is fallacious. And I think you're going to end up with a worldview, a perspective, and you're going to be advocating for things that aren't necessarily going to be for the best when you ignore the reality of oppositional class interests. And that's a fundamental criticism I have of your perspective. But if you don't if you don't believe that there's an ongoing class struggle, I mean, then what I'm saying is stupid. And
I think that is unfortunately the distinction in perspectives here, because I don't believe there is necessarily an ongoing class struggle. It's that this perspective of it's the working class versus whoever's in control, the capitalist, the upper class, the depending on who you speak to, the Jews, etc. I think that's fundamentally wrong. Whereas I believe that there is an us versus them kind of thing going on, but it's everyone versus the government. And I think that regardless of whose government you are, that's going to be the case. I think, generally speaking, whatever government currently exists in whatever location you're at, it's probably not got your best interests at heart, even if it professes to do so. Even if, for example, you are a proletariat dictatorship and you believe that you're for the working class, chances are the outcomes from it are going to be largely beneficial from the ground up, but negative from the top down. And I think we have seen that in China and in the West and everywhere else. But even if that's not the case, even if there is, for example, an actual class struggle between different classes, I think it's the blurred lines that are formed by capitalism, specifically in the West, have meant that it's now significantly harder to recognize who is what. I would consider myself to be a capitalist. You, I think, in your sort of class designations, wouldn't consider me to be a capitalist. You'd probably consider me to be working class. I don't think these are
billions. Do you own politicians?
Well, to be fair, politicians are worth significantly more, and they own companies. I think it's the other way around. But if the government has access to trillions upon trillions and upon trillions of dollars, and they have the ability to print money out of thin air and control people at a whim and send armies to go and massacre people, then I think they're the ones in control, not the people who make iPhones. But that's
I mean, definitely a government is in control, but they are motivated and they have an agenda. And whose agenda is it? I mean, it's the capitalist, the elite capitalist class. So I kind of there's a lot of similarities between a capitalist dictatorship and a proletarian dictatorship, right? Because both are run by a vanguard party that is tasked with identifying class interests and the policies and objectives and strategies for pursuing them. So there's a lot of similarities. So, the CIA, for instance, I kind of see as capitalism's invisible army, and they're kind of tasked with policing other capitalists and making sure that these other capitalists that don't have like Trump is a good example of a capitalist who wanted to do things that were against the capitalist best interest, so all these different factions within the capitalist class come to a consensus, and based on that consensus, that's the strategy that they adopt. So Trump opposed the capitalist class consensus, and we saw what happened. So it's not that different from China. So China, you don't allow, all the workers aren't in charge, because you wouldn't want them to be, because all the workers, they're busy, they don't have time to look at intel, they don't know what's going on in the world, they can't make policy. So you need a vanguard party, that's designated to do that. So Lenin and Marx and Stalin, well, Marx didn't talk too much about proletarian dictatorship. He talked a little bit about it, but Lenin really expounded on it, and then Stalin expounded on it. And they're very insightful as to how it operates and its function. But there's a lot of similarities, in my opinion, between the Western capitalist dictatorships and how they operate, and how a proletarian dictatorship will operate very similarly, only their objectives are different. One is to further the interests of the working class in the class struggle, and the other is to further the interests of the capitalist class in the class struggle.
Okay.
So that's
Go on. So you're saying that's your
that's my perspective. And within the capitalist class, you have a lot of competing but overlapping interests, and ultimately decisions have to be made. So there's a structure for doing that. I think it includes the CIA. It includes their propaganda. Not so much their propaganda, but their surveillance apparatus. Like, they're constantly doing polls and finding people's opinions on things, and they're developing policy in response. And so it's a fluid thing. But again, to take the class dynamic out of it, I think you are entirely, doing yourself a disservice with your analysis, because it's not going to end up being sound, and it's not going to come to conclusions and advocacy that's going to be beneficial. But that,
I can understand that perspective, and I do. I think that it is important to recognize that there are groups at work, and that there are specific parties that work together to further specific agendas, and that there are specifically individual actions taken by things like the CIA and by individual world governments in an attempt to further Western hegemony. I think that's accurate, and I think that for the most part I would oppose them. However, I believe that it's.
Can you take the class out of that? Can you take class out of that equation? Like,
yes, and I can tell you why I can, because as we've previously stated, I do not perceive capitalism as a class of people in control. I perceive that as just individual governments being in control of their areas, and of certain governments trying to specifically influence other areas. For example, the United States government is massively influential in the operations of other governments. For example, utilizing the CIA as a weapon, as a cudgel to manipulate other governments, to install puppet governments, and so on and so forth. These are all things I would oppose. They are things I'm against. I am not in favor of the Americans just turning up at places and killing people and installing their own dictators. That's not something I'm in favor of. I'm against this. Right. However, I don't believe the cause of this is a capitalist class that is controlling everything. This seems to me just to be governments consolidating power. I perceive this as the government doing stuff. You perceive it as capitalism doing stuff. And I think that's the real fundamental disagreement. And I think that instead of thinking of it as the working class versus the capitalist class governments, it's just everyone who isn't the government versus the government. And that's fundamentally, assuming it's the same thing, assuming that just ordinary people are not the quote unquote capitalist class, and that the governments and the large corporations that are other arms of them are all just one homogenous thing that's in control of a large amount of politics and reality, and that they are working together to form some hegemonic group that controls everything. I'm more than happy to accept that framing and oppose that. I just don't think that thinking of it as a class struggle is particularly useful. If, however, you do, and you perceive it that way and think, okay, and the problem is the capitalist class, okay, more than happy to accept that, at which point the best way we can oppose them is by removing the government. Because if you get rid of the government, even if you still have access to the companies that exist, you'll find that a lot of the issues disappear. The ability of the American government to go in and murder people is based on their ability to have access to the CIA. Their ability to turn up and fight a war over some oil is based on their access to the US military. It's not based on, for example, companies that produce phones, or companies that produce computers, or companies that produce cars. These people, these capitalists, aren't in control of it because it doesn't matter to them. It's not one group against another. It's specifically people who have a monopoly on violence versus people who don't. And I think this is the fundamental disagreement. I don't consider those to be capitalism TM. I consider them to be the government TM. And I think that's just as bad, honestly.
But who is, the politician that has the most campaign contributions wins 90% of the time. The richest 0.1% of the United States, richest 0.1%. The richest 0.1% accounts for more wealth than the poorest 90%. Mm-hmm. To me, it's just it's so obvious that the government is an extension of the capitalist class and the rich, wealthy elites, and that they fight amongst themselves about the policies, and they come up with a consensus, and they implement that consensus via their government and all the politicians that they've got into power. And then they pretend it's a democracy, and they own all the media, and they tell everybody, hey, you go out and vote for either politician A or billionaire B, and then, hey, we're the longest democracy in the US. It's ridiculous, but to me, it's intrinsic. The idea that it's money and the wealthy that are in charge of things, including the government and the media and the education system. It's a given. But
the reason I disagree with that is
yeah.
because they aren't. It's reasonable to say that incredibly powerful positions are available in companies and whatnot, and that they have access to large amounts of capital and they can spend lots of money on trying to get specific people into power, and that they can try and get them to vote on specific topics in a specific way. That's entirely possible. It's entirely possible to say that the people who receive the most campaign contributions get elected. That's likely true in the US, because the US has a lot of that kind of things. I know in the UK it's a bit different. Here it's mostly just whoever has been trained to be a politician can win. But it's slightly different between the UK and the US. It's not about campaign contributions here. But even assuming that's true for everything, let's just say it's true for everywhere, that that whoever gets into power is the person with the most money. That's possible. However, as we've seen with things like Trump, people can get in despite not being the chosen disciple of the cathedral. This is not this was not because of massive corporations wanting Trump to get in. They didn't want Trump to get in. They all opposed him. They all attempted to prevent him from getting in. He still managed to get in because at its heart, they do at least attempt to operate in a somewhat democratic way. Again, I'm not actually necessarily in favor of this. I don't think democracy is a good idea. But the assumption that capitalism will always win because they have the money just isn't accurate, because all kinds of things can upset that. And the fundamental problem with it is that it doesn't matter who gets in as long as the government is still in control. And they always are. If you take, for example, in the UK, we have civil servants. I don't know what the American equivalent of that would be. I know they exist. I just don't know what they're called. But people who are what I would classify as the deep state, people like members of the CIA, people like members of the government apparatus that exist regardless of whoever is in control. Those people don't disappear whenever a new election happens. They don't go away. They don't get replaced. They don't get new jobs. They're there all the time, under secretaries, permanent secretaries, etc. People who are actually doing the day-to-day running of the government. These people, doesn't matter who you vote for, they're always in government, and they're the ones that choose what happens. And they're not controlled by capitalists, they're controlled by themselves. And the problem with these people is that if you have someone who's in a position of power, who never leaves, who wasn't elected, who isn't determined by people's positions, who isn't determined by campaign contributions because they don't get elected, who isn't determined by an individual party or anything like that. They're not political actors, they're just individuals. These people have massive influence, massive amounts of control. And the reason they have control is because whatever they decide and whatever they implement is backed by force by the government. And so the issue with them isn't that rich people can pay for them and therefore get their vote. It's that they have the ability to use force to prevent people from doing things or to force people to do things. And that's my issue. It's the issue with government control over stuff. So when you have organizations that don't change, but that have massive amounts of power and that aren't influenced by outside money, it's not capitalism, that's just the government. And that's the vast majority of government apparatus. It's mostly unaccountable, unelected stuff that doesn't get involved with capitalism, that doesn't have capitalist interests, it just has government interests. And I think that's the same in the US. It's not necessarily identical because we have very different structures of government, but I think that might be where part of my issue and part of your issue are coming from. You see capitalism as controlling the government, and I think in the US it's probably closer to the truth than it is here in the UK. I think you're probably more accurate there than you would be here. Is that right?
I don't want to say yes. I mean, of course, we're far more. I want to say we're more capitalist, right? We're less regulated, or
I think you're not actually less regulated, you're just differently regulated. A lot of people say that about the US. They go like, oh, the US, it has like free market healthcare and it's terrible. No, the US healthcare is massively regulated. It's just regulated really badly. And that's the same problem that we have in the UK. Our healthcare is terrible, but it's also socialist healthcare, so people are in favor of it. It's actually atrociously bad. I've never had a positive experience with the NHS, but the problem isn't necessarily regulation or deregulation, it's government control over it. And that's the same with the US. A lot of the issues with American healthcare are caused by regulation. And I don't think socialism would help that. But A lot of people
So
do.
yeah, so I don't want to agree that the capitalist class dominates our government more than the capitalist class dominates the government of Britain or France or any of those. But let's move the direction of our discussion a little bit. And I want because so I have this dogma, and I've repeated it a bunch of times when talking with anarcho-capitalists. So what I say is, human society, that government is a necessary part of human society, that you never have had a society without some form of governments, which includes a form of laws and a system of taxation sufficient enough to enforce the laws. So, in all of recorded human history, I've never seen a society exist apart from law enforcement, and taxation. And I mean, that's essentially government. I think so. I don't think government is superfluous. Government is necessary and existential to human society. I just think that we should have a government that cares about the working class, as opposed to government that is of, by, and for the capitalist class. But so I want to give you an opportunity. I mean, explain what you mean by, like, how can we abolish government? Like, how do we get rid of government? Does that include getting rid of laws and law enforcement and taxation necessary to uphold laws? Because to me, that's what it sounds like. But if that's what you're saying, then and again, it doesn't seem legit. But
I will happily respond. There's a couple of things to say. One is that personally, from my own perspective, yes, I do believe we can exist without a government, without laws, without taxation, and without the enforcement of those laws by people paid for via taxation. However, that I think is an unrealistic goal, specifically because other people won't buy it. I'm not saying it couldn't work. I'm saying that people wouldn't allow it to work. I think that you can very easily operate in a way where you don't require enforcement of specific laws, because for the most part, people don't require them. As long as people are happy and healthy, they typically don't victimize one another. The main perspective I would have is on something called the expansion of the circle of moral consideration. Is this a term you've heard before?
No.
Okay, so basically the way it works is there is a circle of moral consideration that starts with yourself. You're first and foremost in charge of your own safety and your own well-being. That's the person you focus on the most. You need to survive, you need to stay alive, you need to continue and reproduce, and so on and so forth. So you focus on yourself as a moral consideration. If you're trapped in a situation where the only way to survive is to kill someone else, you're probably going to do it because you want to survive first and foremost. If, however, you're living in relative safety, there's no danger around, you have plenty of food, etc., you're going to start expanding your circle of moral consideration to include other people. You're going to include your family and friends. You're going to want them to be happy and safe and secure. And then if you're more well off, you're going to expand the circle to include other countrymen, other people with the same skin color as you, with the same nationality as you, etc. And again, you're going to the more better off you are, the less worry you have in your life, the less in danger you are of other things that might kill you or maim you, or you're running out of food, etc. That you're going to include other things as well. You're going to include other nationalities, you're going to include other people, other locations, and eventually, when you're better off, you're going to include things like animals and other people will end up being, vegetarian and vegan, etc., if they're so well off that they can afford to take into consideration the moral characteristics of other species as well. So from an anarcho-capitalist perspective, the circle of moral consideration will naturally expand the more secure you are in your personhood. And we believe that the best way to achieve this is through a free market, allowing people the right to life, liberty, and property, and utilizing this allow people to prosper because they have access to a free market and the ability to live as they see fit, to produce as they see fit, and to trade as they see fit, because this will provide the greatest amount of prosperity and therefore will result in people being in a position where their circle of moral consideration is the greatest and can include everyone else. That is the perspective of the anarcho-capitalist. As a result, we believe that you can exist in a world without law, etc., because if people are well off enough, they won't need to. People don't need to murder one another when they've got access to food and property and things like that. People just don't have to attack one another. They don't have to fight one another. They don't have to fight over stuff when they've got everything they need. And we think the best way to do this is through capitalism. However, because it's unlikely to occur, what I want to see instead is a gradual reduction in the power of the state and the implementation of more what would we call it? More free market policies by reducing the stranglehold of the state over the individual and allowing people more freedom to interact with one another. You see people freely interact with one another without state intervention all the time. For example, let's take, what's it called? Car boot sales. You ever been to a car boot sale?
Say that again.
You ever been to a car boot sale? I don't know what you would call them in the US. Let's say a garage sale.
I'm not familiar with. That's a colloquialism.
Okay,
car boot
right. So, a car boot sale is a thing that happens in the UK where people will go to a field somewhere, some common property or some place that's owned by like a farmer or whatever, and they'll drive in their cars and they'll open their trunks, I guess you would call them.
Oh
and,
yeah, what do we call those? We call those shoot. They have them like in the big stadium parking lots.
Yes, that kind of thing. Yeah. You'd get out all your wares and you'd sell them to people and passers-by and whatnot. Those are examples of unregulated capitalism. That's people turn up, they sell at whatever market price they deem acceptable. People will purchase with whatever they seem that they find acceptable. People will trade with one another. They'll swap things. They'll do whatever they want, and then everyone goes home and they're fine. Disagreements at these kind of locations will be handled civilly, and they'll be handled in a way that typically does not resolve in bloodshed. People can be armed or they can be unarmed. People can, pay with whatever they see fit to, as long as the other person is happy to accept it. That is an example of unregulated capitalism. That's just capitalism happening in action. I want the world to be a big car boot sale. That's what I want. I want everyone to be free to buy and sell as they see fit, to produce and not produce as they see fit, and to operate with one another with dignity and civility in such a way that no one necessarily needs to fight with one another over an individual piece of property. If everyone knows where they are, if everyone knows what rights they have, that they have the right to life, to liberty, and to property, and that they have the right to own or not own things, I think that's all you really need. If, however, you want to say, well, we need state for X, Y, or Z thing, sure, I will happily accept that we require a state in order to facilitate this. Let's say that the police are necessary because they prevent people from being mugged, raped, etc. Okay, totally fine with that. The problem then becomes the ever expanding government that constantly increases the amount of laws and rules and regulations. I think under Tony Blair's governance in the UK, I think we had on average an extra 8 laws a day while he was prime minister. And there's no way in hell that anyone could ever know what they all were, or know how to follow them, or know how to correctly operate within that kind of framework. When you have the government saying, if you break this law that we've just made up, you're going to prison where you'll be raped or killed, I can't see that as being a workable solution. And in fact, people, for example, in the US, get arrested over pointless things all the time, specifically because of the intervention of the state. You can't collect rainwater in a lot of states in the US because that's illegal. You can't drink unpasteurized milk. You can't do X, Y, or Z other thing that it makes no sense to have a law against, but they have laws against. And this isn't to the benefit of the working class. So again, you would perceive it as being therefore to the benefit of the capitalist class. However, I just see it as the government screwing the little guy over, because that's what they do, because governments are like that. They want more control, they want more power, etc. And I think having as small a state as possible is the best possible outcome. People will happily call me a minarchist or whatever. It's someone who just believes that if the government exists, it should be a night watchman state just there to protect people's rights. I'd be totally okay with that. But the more power you give to the government, the more authority you give them, the more power to create laws, etc., and regulations, the worse everything gets for everyone involved. And I just think that's universally true. I don't know what your perspective is on that, but as far as I can tell, you are not an anarchist, which is, it's just not my perspective.
I think I don't think that's an option, right? I think we can point to bad laws and we can agree that there's bad laws, but that's kind of society's job to, that's their struggle. That's the struggle of humanity. It's going to go on for thousands of years, is to figure out how to organize ourselves. But I think it's utopian to think we can get to a point where we're not going to need laws or law enforcement or, a system of taxation sufficient enough to enforce laws. There's always going to be bad laws. It's always going to be a struggle. I think what is not necessary is having the government dominated by capitalist class interests. Again, let me rephrase that, because if I'm going to use your definition of capitalist, where people that just want markets are capitalists, or they want I can't even remember that word. Flea market. It's a flea market.
That would be the American equivalent of flea market. Yes, you're quite right.
So if we're going to consider people who just want humanity to exist in an unregulated flea market type thing, if those are capitalists, I would need to rephrase what my position is. So my position would be that the capitalist elite that own and control the Western government and all the institutions, including the media, etc., they have no interest in seeing the kind of changes that you're advocating for. They will fight against those changes, just like they will fight against the working class trying to bring a working class dictatorship to society. So they have no interest. So to me, capitalism is what happens when you have capitalism and you have a few people become the owners of the means of production. They become obscenely wealthy, and then they start using their wealth to take over the government, take over the media, and then they develop a self-perpetuating system that allows them to have all these tools and levers to maintain and enlarge their own already obscenely disproportionate
amounts of wealth, power.
Amount of wealth, power, and privilege. So they are not likely to listen to you and say, yeah, let's do that. Just
I 100% agree. I definitely
like they're not going to listen to me and say, yeah, let's do that. I think
you're quite right here. I think that the problem we're going to have isn't that it's not feasible. It's that specifically the people in power won't allow it to occur. I'm more than happy to accept that the people currently in control don't want what I want. That's fine. I'm more than willing to accept that's true. I think that's true in the West. I think it's true in the East. I think it's true everywhere. Nobody who is currently in power wants what I want. That's true. But I don't think the problem is capitalism. I think the problem is the government. I think that it doesn't matter who gets in, the government is always in charge. And as a result, that's the problem. I think if we can successfully get rid of the government, fantastic. But we will not be able to get rid of the government through democracy. You can't do it, specifically because of selective theory, because of even what you said of there are things that influence who gets into power that are beyond our control. For example, the party that I mostly identify with in the UK is the Libertarian Party. It's also the same within the US. I would identify most strongly with the Libertarian Party in the US. However, chances are they're never going to get in. And it's not necessarily because they're not popular. They may well be popular. It's that there are so many things in place to prevent that from happening that they will never have a chance to try and perform the changes necessary to bring about the worldview that I espouse. And that is going to be true regardless of what location you're in, because whoever's in power is going to try and consolidate and maintain that power at all costs, because that's what it's about. It's about people in power, having power, maintaining that power, consolidating that power, increasing that power, and just carrying on being in charge. If you want to label them as the capitalist class, then I will happily accept that framing and say, yes, I also oppose the capitalist class being in control. I disagree that that's what they are, but I fundamentally agree with you that the problem is that they're in control, and it will continue to be the problem because they will continue to be in control because they have the power to keep themselves in power. And I think that power being a self-perpetuating problem is the problem itself. Once you have a monopoly on force and a monopoly on violence, and you can change the world as you see fit in order to maintain your power, you're going to do so. And I think that's the major issue we have here. And based on that, I would oppose both Western and Eastern states, because I don't believe that the Eastern states have the proletariat in mind when it comes to their particular goals. But even assuming that they do, and that you are correct to support them, I think that you and I fundamentally oppose Western governments for the same reason, which is that they don't support the working class. They don't support things that would actually benefit the working class, and that their continued power is a problem. And I think I'm more than happy to accept that.
Well, that's good. I mean, it's very magnanimous of you to adopt my framework and then say, I agree if that's the framework we go with, but I think of the framework's a little bit different. No, and that's why we're having a really good discussion. I appreciate it. I would say, as a Marxist-Leninist, I have the example of a success, right? So again, I look at the Soviet Union and see success. I look at modern China, especially right now, and I see tremendous success. I see a success that is impossible to overstate. Like when you do as much as the CPC has done for the working class, and you see how much the working class appreciates their government, like it's a no-brainer. But I'm not sure I see any examples of where your approach, your worldview has succeeded that you can point to and say, here's what we need to do. So in lieu of that, or maybe you do, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but how do we see the change come about? Because like I have all the answers for that, how we do it. I've seen it happen.
Okay.
We can do it. We've done it again. But how? Yeah.
I do have a method, and it's called being post-political. It's a concept that is basically, it's actually very similar to Marx's worldview. Marx viewed, if I recall correctly, it's been a long time since I read the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, etc. I believe he viewed history as a sort of an inevitable progression towards specific states. So he saw capitalism as one step towards future socialism and communism and the proletariat of the dictatorship. Sorry, the dictatorship of the proletariat, my apologies. And I see history in the same sort of way. I believe that there is going to be a progression towards inevitable anarcho-capitalism, and there is a reason for this. I believe that the ability of people to operate within a free market and to innovate is significantly greater than the ability of the government to react to it. For example, when people come up with some sort of new technology, some new way of doing something, the government immediately, doesn't matter which government it is, always responds by trying to prevent it from enacting the change that people, for example, like myself, would want to see implemented. For example, the invention of the internet was something that people couldn't have foreseen. It allowed unparalleled communication between people and the ability for information to spread in like wildfire. You can immediately tell people on the other side of the world something that they couldn't previously have heard. It allows for greater communication, greater information, and therefore greater ability to share ideas. Increased levels of technology like this are inevitable in a free market, and free markets exist until a government steps in. As a result, people will inevitably create new technologies in ways that governments haven't had the ability to prevent yet. For example, the advent of 3D printing technology, relatively new phenomenon, something the governments are starting to try and regulate now, but there was a brief period of time where there was no regulation and therefore people could do whatever they wanted. One of the first things they did was figure out a way to produce firearms that could be produced via 3D printing immediately. This kind of democratization of owning a way to prevent tyranny, in this case, the ability to produce firearms, is something that governments will attempt to control, but it was something that was inevitably going to occur under a free market system, under capitalism, and that will result in people having the ability to defend themselves better. It's that kind of innovation that will inevitably result in people becoming ungovernable. We will get to the point where technology is increasing at such a rate and in such a way that people's ability to be free will far outstrip government's abilities to control us. And we will get to the point where, for example, the internet is being subverted. The Chinese government's ability to control the internet is being subverted by the invention of VPNs. People's ability to subvert government control will continue to increase to the point where it will become unfeasible to be a totalitarian state. You will be incapable of doing so. And what will happen is capitalism will eventually result in people being free automatically just because there's no way people can be controlled. And I think there's going to be some sort of violent clash between people who want to be free and people who want control, and that this will be massive. It will probably have massive detrimental effects on people, and I'm not going to be okay with it, but I think it's going to happen. I think it's inevitable. And I think that the result of this, the end result, will either be total government control by them just stamping down on everyone, or governments basically no longer needing to function because we just have the technology to ignore them, and people being free. And I don't know how long it'll take. Don't know if it'll be 100 years, if it'll be 1,000 years, or if it'll be next week. It's what we're waiting for is something that allows for the democratization of freedom, people being able to go about their lives without the government interfering. We're seeing little drops here and there, people being able to communicate with other people freely via the internet, people being able to produce weapons that the government can't regulate via things like 3D printing. We'll see more and more of that inevitably as technology develops, to the point where suddenly governments can't stop us doing what we want to do, and people will just live the lives they want. And I think that's the way it's going to happen. But I'm optimistic about it. I think it's something that might seem dubious or unrealistic, but I would like to believe that that's the way it's going to be. And I think that there is some sort of what would you call it? I think there is precedent for it, because every time the government tries to do something, something will come up, some technology will be invented that completely subverts the government's ability to do something, and then they either have to step in and quash it, or they have to accept it and move on. For example, the post office in the US, the US Postal Service was the only way to transport stuff from one place to another. Lysander Spooner, a capitalist, came up with a faster way to do it, charged less than the government did a better service, and so they arrested him, put him in prison, and then made it illegal for anyone to compete. And that is not capitalism, that is the government doing things to prevent capitalism from occurring. And the result of that was that there couldn't be any more market innovation, there couldn't be any improvements, until it became impossible for the government to stop people. And then suddenly you get things like UPS and FedEx, etc., and other companies just doing what the government said no one else was allowed to do, because the government couldn't stop them. And that's what we're going to get. We're going to get capitalism slowly defeat the government by doing what the government does, but better and cheaper and faster, and allowing people to live their lives how they want without government interference. I think that's the way I see the future happening, and I'm hopeful that that's going to be the case.
That's a great articulation of your optimism. No, I mean,
no, I agree.
It's a great, I mean, no, I'm giving you props for being able to articulate that now. And to give myself props, if we were debating this on, through text in our group, I would have said something really mean a long time ago and totally shut you up, and we would have stopped talking. So, I mean, I'm glad I'm exercising restraint. And this was the whole point of the video, of the video too, was just to try and demonstrate how, adults can have great conversations, and we can hear and learn from other people's perspectives. What struck me about what you said, and again, really good articulation of what you thought. I mean, I am being sincere. And I mean, so you're a great person to engage with, and I'm just glad you were willing to do this. My thoughts about that, I'm thinking about kids in Guatemala or sub-Saharan Africa, and their concern isn't freedom, right? They want to eat. They want another meal. And I'm thinking, we need to not just get so focused on our first world, what's the word? Like we're a very developed country. We have interests that are totally detached from the interests of the vast majority on the planet. And I think, to help the people, the vast majority of it, we're going to need to do a few things. Economic planning, right? We need to plan how to develop various societies and create the infrastructure, the self-sustaining. I mean, you can't just free market hunger from people in sub-Saharan Africa.
I'm willing to accept that that's probably the case, assuming you have an isolated system. In sub-Saharan Africa, there will be issues related to the fact that geography is a bitch. There's a lot of things about it that you can't do. There's a reason that civilization developed in the Fertile Crescent. It was because we had access to everything being on the same latitude, the same latitudinal line. So there was relatively similar climates, etc.
What I'm saying is that different societies are going to prioritize different things.
Yes.
For you, freedom is a big priority. You want economic freedom. You don't want anybody telling you what to do. But for a lot of the world, like, they just want to eat. Like, freedom is way down on the list. They want a government that's going to provide them food. And so I think, that's something that needs to be processed in.
I'm happy to accept that. I agree that for people, human actualization is a low priority, and everything else, for example, survival, is the highest priority. I get that. I'm totally willing to accept
And
that.
I think it's going to get worse with current events, with the cost of wheat and all kinds of things going to skyrocket, and fertilizers. I think there's going to be a lot of hunger and deprivation in the developing world, way worse than we've seen.
Oh yes, definitely. I think that one of the issues I had with the lockdowns implemented in the West and in China after the COVID quote unquote pandemic was the knock-on effect that it had on the developing world. This was something that people refused to bring up, but that I kept pointing out every single time. I would say, well, look, because of the disruption to the supply chain, we're starving millions of people in Africa. This is a massive issue. What we need are free markets and people being able to trade so that, people don't starve to death. But, the government shutting down free trade and preventing people from doing so did in fact result in millions of people dying. You're quite right. And as a result, I think that it showed yet again that the result of central planning and government control over the means of production is a massively negative thing and resulted in lots of people's deaths. I think that if you want to have better chances of individuals surviving in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, what you need is people to be able to develop them by owning and operating means of production, by investing through capital, and by allowing for the introduction of private property rights and free trade and people being able to produce for themselves. If you have, you can say that, for example, somewhere where there's nothing is technically capitalism because, oh, it's free. No one's stopping you from doing anything there because there's no one there. You could say that's technically capitalism. I think that's a bit of an abstraction, but I think that existing in a state where there's some warlord somewhere who's happy to massacre your family because they're in control, and that not being conducive to a prospering, thriving society is not necessarily going to be solved by a government turning up and saying, actually, we're going to be communists now. Like, I don't think that the problems of sub-Saharan Africa can be solved by instituting socialism. And in fact, the areas of South Africa, etc., that have instituted socialism have found that there have been problems with it, particularly the ones where they've established specific characteristics as being proportional to class. For example, in South Africa, where they chose to separate white and black people as individual classes, and saying that the white farmers, etc., were automatically wrong because they owned and operated means of production, because they owned property, and because they were generally successful, and got rid of them because they were part of the capitalist class, and replaced them with government control over the means of production. And the result was famines, and they've lost out on lots of food and operation, because when you get rid of people who know what they're doing and have access to things because they've successfully contributed to society, producing money and food and things like that, and you give it instead to the government, who then assigns whoever they want to do stuff, the result is largely negative. I think that saying that we can just fix problems by putting in socialist or communist governments is not necessarily actually going to be solving the problem. And I think that the biggest issue we have is that geography doesn't care about your political aspirations. It's always going to be the case that some places are just worse than others because of geography, and that if you want to modify them by, I don't know, geolandscaping or by terraforming in specific locations, you can do so. But the problem is you're still going to have the problem of if it's a bad location to live, that's not going to change. Trying to live in a desert is never going to be massively successful compared to trying to live in France. That's just how reality works.
So like in Libya, Gaddafi invested heavily. He sold oil and he got a bunch of wealth, and he developed aquifers to irrigate the desert. And it was quite successful. So Libya was, by every metric, the best off country in all of Africa, largely due to a plan. So
I'm not saying plans can't work. They definitely can work. And I don't know enough about Libya to be able to comment on it. I can't say I necessarily agree or disagree in this case, but assuming that's the case, and assuming that's a positive thing, then fantastic, great. I'd be more than happy to see that. But you could still do so without a government. You could just have capitalists do it instead. the question is, would it be successful? And I think that ultimately, if you come up with a plan that says,
make capitalists to do anything, right? Like, I mean,
oh, you can't. So go on, carry on.
So so the government, if you have a political party, you say, hey, we're going to do this. This is our plan. Vote for us, and then they get into power, and then they do that plan, and it benefits everybody. Like, to me, inherently, that's not a bad thing. I mean, to me, inherently, that's how things should be, and that's the ideal.
I'd be happy to accept that. If you said, we're the government, we're here to help, and the result was that you actually helped, then fantastic. I think generally that doesn't happen. I think usually the positions of any individual government and their desired outcomes are usually the opposite of what actually happens. However, that's not to say that they can't do good things. Governments have done good things. They have resulted in benefits, and that's a good thing.
I go back to, there's a very important component, is the class nature of the government, because a government of by and for the working class is probably going to be able to do better things than a government that is of, by, and for the capitalist class, that only pretends to want to help the working class, but really in actuality sees the working class as a threat and an enemy, and wants to do as little as possible for them, because there's an opposition of interest. So increased wages means less profits, right? More jobs available means higher wages. So there's a give and take. There's a push and pull of the class, the economic interest, and also the political interest, right? The working class doesn't want the U.S. to have military installations in 75% of the world's countries, being in perpetual war, having an arms industry that's funding Islamic radicals, funding neo-Nazis, funding narco death squads, training, funding, arming, leading narco death squads in Central America to keep a socialist guy from implementing land reform. Like, that's not in the interest of the U.S. working class, but that's the government we get because it's a dictatorship. There's no such thing as democracy. I love that you let me talk and say all those things.
I'm more than happy to accept that framing of the U.S. government does things that are not in the benefits, that are not in the class interests of the working class. I'm more than happy to accept that, and I'm happy to accept as well that the reason for this is because they themselves have different class interests, and that their funding of specific actions, like, for example, the toppling of foreign governments, etc., are specifically to further their interests. I do, however, disagree that they are specifically capitalist interests. But again, I think this is just coming down to our difference of definitions.
They're not working class interests either, though, right? They're certainly not working class.
Some of them certainly won't be. I'd be happy to say that a lot of them aren't, but sometimes the government does implement things that the working class believe are to their betterment. For example, in the UK, there was I can't remember when it was. I think it might have been 1919. We made it against the law for companies to sue for lost profits from industrial action by the working class. So if you were a member of a what are they called? If we've completely forgot what they're called, labor union. If you're a member of a labor union and you went on strike, then the company that you worked for were no longer allowed to sue you or to do anything sort of retributive in order to penalize you for your strike action. The result of this was that people went on strike constantly for higher wages. This supposedly benefited the working class because it meant that if you were a member of a labor union, you could just keep going on strike and getting more money, and keep going on strike and getting more money. The result of this was that the organizations, the industries that had the most membership in these labor unions ended up with fewer and fewer employees because it became more and more expensive to employ them, and the industries that they were part of became more and more expensive because of the increased cost of labor due to the strike action, that they eventually became uncompetitive and they lost their jobs. The result of this was, for example, Margaret Thatcher having to close the nationalized coal mines as a result of continual strike action that resulted in people getting paid more and more. Sure, it benefited the individual workers who were part of those strike actions, who were constantly getting paid higher and higher wages as a result of this, outstripping inflation. But the result was the inevitable closure of the British coal industry, the loss of all the jobs owned by those people, etc. And the problem wasn't necessarily that the working class were getting what they wanted. They were. The problem was that the government was regulating an industry that was resulting in non-competitive pricing because it wasn't operating in a free market, and that resulted in negative outcome, not only for the government, but also for the working class that tried to implement these positions. So even if you have a perspective that where the government is trying to do something for the people, the negative outcomes caused by interference in the market are still something that will continue to happen. And just saying that you're doing something for the working class doesn't necessarily mean that it will actually benefit the working class in the long run, or even in the short
That's
term.
a good point. I agree with that. You know, and again, yeah, I mean, it's not easy to determine which policy. That's tough. And I think a lot of experimentation. I don't think it's a settled science. I think there's, you know, economists that have their degrees that like to pretend economics is some kind of a hard science, and they push this certain thing. But I think you know, there's a lot of experimentation that we still have to do. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to, because, you know, we have a Western imperialist power that has no interest in changing things or allowing other things to be tried that could be of benefit to the working class, because they are doing as good as they could possibly do, and there's no room for improvement for them. So they want the status quo, and they want to resist any kind of effort that's going to rock the boat or change, especially if that change could see them lose out on their vast disproportion of wealth, power, and privilege. But I don't think those people are working class, right? The people we're talking about are billionaires and millionaires, the owners of industries, the owners of banks. Like, those are the people, and they're unified. They have you know, Western Europe, the United States, and these, they don't offer us democracy. They don't offer the working class a vote that can really make a difference. The minute voting can change the system, they're going to make it illegal. They're going to criminalize it.
I can see why that would be the case, and I think that in a lot of areas they will certainly attempt to do so. However, I think there is a certain level of that they don't anticipate, that they think that people can't control, but that they can. For example, we mentioned earlier, Trump getting into power was not something they anticipated. I personally believe that the most recent United States general election was, I think, heavily manipulated in order to ensure that Trump didn't win a second term.
I agree.
However, one of the prime examples of the working class actually getting what they wanted was Brexit. This was something that was hugely negative for the people in power. They did not want it. They did not want Brexit at all. They tried everything in their power to stop it from happening. They wanted to be a member of the European cabal of nations controlling everything through government regulation, and leaving the European Union was entirely a working class thing. It was the removal of the ability to get cheap labor from other locations. It's the purpose of it specifically was working class people don't want unfettered immigration. They don't want cheap labor coming in from other locations. They don't want to be competing with other people. They don't want to have their wages suppressed by massive amounts of unregulated immigration. That was entirely a working class position that they wanted, and they succeeded in getting it. And the result has been that we've had wages increase massively as a direct result of it. This is something the capitalist class, as you would call them, didn't want, and the working class, as you would call them, did want, and they've got it. And it has worked.
I would say a couple things. So I would say, just like with Trump, you know, Trump had capitalist class supporters, but he was opposed by the capitalist class consensus. I think Brexit was the same way. Brexit was opposed by the capitalist class consensus, but it definitely had its funders and its capitalist benefactors that, you know, put up politicians that opposed it. And it did end up being good for the working class, just like, you know, I think some of, I shouldn't say that. I don't want to say good things about Trump, but definitely insofar as he was wanting to be friends with Russia, I think would have been much preferable to the capitalist class consensus of let's start a war with Russia. So
I am also not in favor of war with Russia. I'm totally in favor of not going to war with Russia.
But you know, what else can we say? I've appreciated this discussion. I think there's going to be a lot of things for people to discuss regarding our differences in our how we articulated them. I'm not sure I have anything profound to say off the top of my head that is gonna be anything anybody is going to be interested in hearing. Do you want to say anything else? I mean, you want to try and summarize or?
Not necessarily. Well, sure, I'll give it a go, actually. I think, well, thank you for the discussion. I think it has been quite fruitful. I believe that ultimately the things we agree on are the important things, which are that the government being in control in the West has been largely negative, and everything that they do is not to the benefit of the working class, and that therefore we ought to oppose them, and that they are going to continue to attempt to be in control and to maintain their hegemony over the working class, and that we ought to oppose them wherever possible, but that it will be difficult to do so due to the totalizing nature of the power structure in the government. However, I personally believe that the same is true of Eastern governments in forms of the CCP and the CCCP. I'm happy to have just that disagreement and us both agreeing that Western governments suck for those reasons, but I will maintain that my position is that Eastern governments also suck for the exact same reasons. However, totally fine, as long as you're happy to let me live my life the way I live, and I'm happy to let you live the way your life the way you want to live.
I'm okay for
fantastic.
Now.
That's the problem. See, I'm more than happy to just let you live your life, but you'll only be happy with letting me live my life until you're in power.
And I think as long as you don't actively try and subvert the progress that responsible, progressive-minded people attempt, we have no problem. And I think the gulags exist for those people that actively tried to, undermine and, subvert the efforts of the fledgling worker state. So, if you just minded your own business and lived your life, like, we don't care. But if you try and undermine, but anyway, I don't even know why I started another argument. I'm sorry. But so I think if I stop the video, I can just stop recording. I'll just stop recording, and then we can wrap it up. And I'll thank you one more time for joining me. So anyway, I hopefully people found this informative or educational or entertaining at least. Yes. And then hopefully they'll, I'll post it. I'll try and figure out how to take it from the cloud, post it on the group, and then people can discuss it. Thank you. Lovejoy is easier. I'll just call you Lovejoy. Thank you, Lovejoy. And I'll stop it now, and then